Happy ADA Day. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you for the third year in a row at the Center for American Progress Action Fund for our commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm Rebecca Coakley, the director of the Disability Justice Initiative here. Full participation, equality of opportunity, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. Those were pretty lofty goals in 1990, but they remain at the horizon still 30 years later. It's hard to believe, but the ADA was written at a time before the internet or the gig economy. There were issues like state violence, the civil rights of disabled parents, that the law really didn't take into account back when it was written. We're here today because of the ADA generation, or the first generation of Americans with disabilities to grow up at the nexus of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the ADA. This generation, of which I'm a part, are now parents, raising kids in the time of a pandemic, civil unrest, and a recession. And while they're thinking about, there's still a lot of work to do. If you would have told me that 12 different candidates would have prepared disability policy platforms back in 2020, I don't think I would have believed you. If you would have also told me that 2 of those candidates would actually reach out directly to disabled people who helped work on their platforms and personally thank them, I would have totally not believed you. And okay, so I missed Secretary Castro's call because I was stuck in a tunnel on Amtrak. That said, though, I never would have imagined that we would have seen the unprecedented level of engagement that we're seeing today. The dynamic between the disability community and policymakers is shifting in a powerful way. Such progress has been made in our community, but there's still much more to be done. And I'm really grateful on a daily basis for the passion and the work ethic and the dedication of our grassroots movement. Nothing has ever been gained for disabled people and our families without the work of folks on the ground. So we brought together today what I have to say is quite literally the most amazing, most eclectic, most world-changing group of people to talk about what it means for the ADA to hit 30 and where we go from here. We are beyond thrilled to have Senator Warren and Secretary Castro join our CEO Neera Tanden in a discussion, and then follow it up with Vilissa Thompson, who will be facilitating a panel of change makers. Before I pass you to Neera, I want to take a moment to thank my team, thank Action Fund's events team, and all of our accommodation support. I leave you with the quote I end every DJI centered event with, which was also our first tweet. From Congressman Major Robert Odell Owens, our enemy is segregation. And with that, I turn this over to you, Neera, and I want to add thank you again for 3+ years ago believing in this project and this work back when no one else did. Happy ADA Day.
Hi, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be with you, and really just want to say I could not be more thrilled to be with 2 leaders who work tirelessly, not really just work, fight tirelessly to ensure that opportunity, the path to opportunity is widened for all Americans, and who see disability policy as a central goal and a central aspect of the work they do across the board. And so they've really centered disability policy. They just centered it in their campaigns and have centered it in their work. And so we're so thrilled to have both Secretary Julian Castro and Senator Warren with us. And I hope that they can come on the screen. Great to see you both.
Good to see you.
I'll start off with just a basic question to both of you, which is, why did you make disability policy such a central issue to your campaigns? And I'll ask you to follow up with how we can ensure that it's a centered issue for all candidates going forward. And I'll start with you, Senator Warren.
Oh, okay. I was going to offer to let Julian go first because he went first on this during the campaign.
Okay, if he would like to go first, that's good by me.
Go ahead, Julian. You just
first of all,
it's great place.
Thank you, Senator. It's great to be here with Senator Warren and, of course, with you, Neera, and thank y'all at CAP for convening such an important conversation. Yeah, I mean, for me, you know, the vision that we laid out for our country is of a country where everyone counts and where everybody can live a life of dignity. So it was important for me in the campaign and our team to put forward a strong plan for how we're going to ensure that people with disabilities can also live that life of dignity, especially because we know that too oftentimes in our country's history, we failed the disability community. And so just fundamentally, it was about making sure that every single person in this country counts and that we could have an America where everybody can live a life of dignity.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So I just want to add to what Secretary Castro said, and that is, I think our best values as Americans center around the notion that we are trying to be a country that works not just for a thin slice of Americans, but a country that works for everyone. And that applies to me across the board. And it means we have to be a nation that works for people in the disability community. You know, I was a special education teacher, and I used to work with little children who had disabilities. And it's really at the heart of it to see that everyone in this country deserves opportunity to be who they can be and to be a part of everything we're doing. You know, I also want to say a very special thanks to Rebecca. I love her notion. The enemy is segregation. This is about everyone being included, everyone having an opportunity. And what I see now is that policies and plans from the 2020 primary should now be the floor, not the ceiling, for what Democratic voters expect of their elected leaders. It is not enough to talk about policies that support the disability community every 4 years, or to talk about them as if they exist in a silo. It is the job of every elected official in every policy proposal that they develop to ask themselves deliberately how that particular policy in education, in healthcare, in transportation, in housing, you name it, how that particular policy affects individuals with disabilities, and to ask themselves what they can do to ensure that the needs of people with disabilities are included front and center. And it is the job of advocates like all the people who are joining us today to hold elected officials accountable, hold all of us accountable by contacting your elected officials at all levels of government and making sure that all of us support the disability community.
Great. I'd love to follow up with that question. I would like to follow up with that answer with a question that connects to what we're experiencing now. With the COVID crisis, we are likely to see the largest number of increases in the disability community that we've seen since the advent of HIV/AIDS. And we're having a deep conversation in the country about the social safety net. And I'd like to ask you both, how do you see that conversation changing? And how would we change the structures of the social safety net to better address the needs of people with disabilities?
Well, I'll start here on this one. And that is to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the gaping holes in our social safety net that make it harder for people with disabilities to make ends meet, to protect their families, to stay healthy. As Congress confronts the acute crisis of this pandemic, and it makes reforms in the aftermath of the pandemic, lawmakers must center the voices of people with disabilities in its policy making. And that means, for me, boosting programs like home and community-based services that people with disabilities have been calling for years. It means expanding Social Security benefits, including for people with disabilities. And it means rewriting the rules of government programs like Social Security Disability Insurance and SSI. It also means being vigilant in pushing back against Republican-led efforts that would make it harder for people with disabilities to access services and to demand equal treatment in schools and in healthcare and with providers. I think all of this is essential as we go forward. We have this moment of opportunity for change. And a big part of that change needs to be centering our policies around the disability community.
Secretary Castro,
Yeah.
I'd love to just ask you the same question. How do you see things, how do you see the social safety net changing now to better address the needs of people with disabilities?
I mean, I think Senator Warren said it very well and with specifics, and so I won't go over all of each of those policy specifics. I agree with all of them. I think both of our plans included that. I would just begin by saying very briefly that, as we go forward, and this is something that CAP has been, proselytizing on, working on for a long time, we need to recognize when it comes to investing in the social safety net that that the era of small government, small, incompetent, ineffective government is over in this country. When you think about the big moments in our country over the last 15 years, Katrina, you think about the Great Recession, and this COVID-19 experience, the challenge was not that we had government that was too big or too robust, or too competent or effective. It was actually the opposite. That we had a government that did not have the means, that was not able to act fast enough, that was incompetent. I'm thinking especially of the coronavirus and the Katrina experience at responding. And so what it means is there's an urgency to plugging those gaps, as Senator Warren said, and there's a mind shift that needs to happen that I believe actually is reflected in a lot of Americans, but needs to be reflected at every level, the city, the state, and the federal level, in terms of making those investments. And the only other thing I'll say about that is, and I think you can glean this from both of what we've said so far, which is that we do need to connect the dots and to integrate all of these things together, right? Healthcare with housing, with employment, with other aspects of quality of life and economic mobility.
Great. I'd love to actually just follow up, Secretary Castro, on one of the issues you raised, which is housing. I know you've tackled every issue, but given your previous role as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, we are facing a particular crisis in housing right now, and people with disabilities are incredibly vulnerable right now. What are your thoughts on how to address this critical crisis in the moment, how we can have housing policies that reflect the needs of all Americans, including people with disabilities?
Yeah, and I want to commend Senator Warren for getting legislation put into the HEROES Act that actually addresses this evictions crisis. She's been fantastic on this issue. So that's even more urgent for people with disabilities. I would say two things, both right now and going forward. It's clear that we need a massive investment in rental assistance and other means so that people can stay in their homes. It's also clear that we need a recommitment in this country to programs like Section 811, which is HUD's program for people with disabilities, and to continue to link up housing and healthcare, these supportive services that ensure that for people with disabilities, they're able to live a good quality of life and to stay in their home if that's what they choose to do. And so, the plans that were put out, several of the plans that were put out in the presidential campaign called for that. And Vice President Biden's plan also calls for that. We need to link those two and be investing through Medicaid or other means in ensuring that people with disabilities are able to get the care they need and to stay in their home.
Right. If I could just add to that, I agree entirely with everything that Secretary Castro has said. I just want to be specific here. Right now, one of the big fights in the Senate is I want to get my bill that says we're going to have an eviction moratorium that lasts for a year from the onset of the crisis, basically until March of next year. And that moratorium doesn't just apply to about 25% of renters, but it applies across the board and gives full protection. There are other parts to the bill about making sure that landlords get some payment assistance, but the key is that no one gets moved out of their housing during a pandemic. This is a health issue, it's an economic issue, and it is also a moral issue. And if I can, I'll just put in one more quick plug, and that is for Secretary Castro's bigger point, and that is the need to make a long-term investment in housing. I've proposed about $500 billion over 10 years to build 3.2 million new housing units across this country. More affordable housing, more housing for middle-class families, for working-class families, for the working poor, for the poor, for people with disabilities, for seniors who want to age in place, for people who've been incarcerated and are trying to make it back into their communities. We need a big investment in housing. And when we do that, we can bring down costs for everyone. We've got a supply problem in this country. We can bring down costs. We can help people, both renters and people who want to buy. And my plan has in it, for the first time, addressing the impact of redlining and sets aside money for first-time home buyers to be able to purchase homes in formerly redlined neighborhoods. So I agree with the Secretary's approach. We need some real protection right now in the middle of this pandemic, but we cannot let up on the idea that we need a big long-term investment. That's how we'll make real change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I wanted to follow up with you actually on the issue of childcare. Sure. You've put forward a really fantastic series of proposals, frankly, on childcare, and have drafted proposals that really truly address the needs of people with disabilities. So I'd love to just have if you could talk about childcare and the stresses that is placing right now, and how we can better address the needs of kids with disabilities and families. That would be, I think, really instructive for the audience.
So, this is, in a sense, it's like our conversation over housing. We have an immediate problem, but we have a long arc problem. And the pandemic has just shown us how acute the issue is right now. So here's my proposal. Let's put $50 billion in emergency funding for childcare providers in this upcoming coronavirus package. Without this emergency funding, many childcare providers are going to go out of business permanently, and that's going to make it harder for all working families to go back to work when it's safe. Beyond that, we need to be making an investment in universal childcare so that all families, including families of kids with disabilities, have access to safe, affordable, high-quality childcare, so that kids have an early education experience that is high quality and that reassures the parents that these children are where they belong, that they are getting the kind of educational experience that they need and that they are entitled to. So for me, as I think about this crisis, I want us to get that money into childcare. Again, it really is. It's about our health care. We need all of our children to have access to childcare so that essential workers can be out there on the front lines. It's about our economy so that we can reopen our economy. And it is ultimately a moral issue. What higher use of money can we talk about than investing in our children? So please, let's do this one. This one's really important.
I know, and really important decisions are being made now on these issues, so it's really vital to have this discussion. I wanted to just ask, speaking of children, connect back to a discussion of our schools. Right now, the country is having an ongoing conversation about school openings, and we have, with the virus, significant challenges around instruction at limited in-person time in the school buildings, and there's real concern about the digital divide, and particularly the needs of kids with disabilities who are facing challenges with online learning and facing challenges with, actually going into schools that may be unsafe. I know Republicans today are talking about linking money for aid to schools for that money to only go to schools that are reopening. And I'd love just both of your senses, both of your views on the ongoing discussion about school reopening and from the lens of parents of children with disabilities who have particular needs that must be addressed. And I'd love to start off with you, Secretary Castro.
We're in a heartbreaking situation right now for so many families because, and Erica and I have an 11-year-old daughter who is about to start 6th grade and a son who's 5 who's about to start kindergarten. And so, like many parents, we're waiting to see what the school district, the public school district that they go to, is going to do. Right now, they've announced that at least the first 3 weeks of instruction are going to be online only, and then they're going to make a decision about in-person attendance. We're talking today about students with disabilities, and to me, that is, a real heartbreaking part of this, because we know that those are exactly the students that are on the other side of that technology divide, digital divide, and also the students who probably most need to or could benefit from being in a classroom in person, and yet also some of the most susceptible if they have a compromised immune system, susceptible to real injury from the virus. So I believe right now, at least as a parent and as a policymaker, that it's probably better to be safe than sorry. And just as a personal matter, I mean, we wouldn't, here in Texas, we would not send our kids back right now, given how quickly the virus is spreading in the state. What does that mean? That means that we need to have the investments in place to make sure that we close that digital divide, that students who have a disability are able to learn, that they get the attention and the focus that they deserve. This links up to the larger issue of fully funding the IDEA, for instance, going forward, and also investing in those teachers and ensuring that they have the means to be able to convey knowledge effectively. And then to be able to respond quickly as situations change, and to get back, hopefully as soon as possible when it's safe, to as normal and then above normal, better than before, for these students, so that they're able to fully reach their potential, in this school year and in the years to come.
Fantastic. Senator Warren, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
So I would, I feel like much of this conversation about reopening our schools is upside down. The federal government must act to contain the spread of COVID-19 through increased testing, contact tracing, and supply chain management. The best way to safely reopen our schools and to keep them open is to significantly reduce the spread of the virus in the community outside the walls of this school. So in my view, that needs to be the heart of it. Get our arms around the COVID-19 problem, and then work with our teachers, work with our other school personnel, and work with parents about how to safely reopen these schools. It also is going to require an investment of resources again. Congress should be funding investments in broadband to ensure that all communities, regardless of zip code or ability or income, can access education resources if they aren't able to return safely to school. And when it comes to sending kids back to school safely, it's critical that our reopening plans do not reinforce existing inequities. The needs of students with disabilities and parents with disabilities must be front and center as communities assess their options. We're also going to need real investments to address the learning loss that students with disabilities and all of our students may have experienced since the pandemic. And I believe we're going to need to make more investment in mental health services for our children. For many children, this has been a very traumatic time, and we're going to need more support. All of those things cost money, and it's important that Congress be putting the resources in. We have to get this right. The education and the safety of our children with disabilities is counting on it.
Thank you so much for that. I think the comments that you both made about schools really highlight the earlier comments made by Secretary Castro, which is we are having a governance failure with the virus, and the inability of the Trump administration and his leadership to deal with this virus, have a national plan, is in a sense, creating victims throughout our society, and our schools, our school children, children with disabilities are really facing tremendous challenges because we have not addressed this basic issue of governance. A competent administration plan to deal with the virus would improve outcomes across the board here. So I really want to thank you for making clear how much issues of disabilities connect up with everything, every other issue from housing to childcare to the economy. And really just want to say once again how profoundly grateful we are for the leadership you've both demonstrated, not just in this campaign, but over many years, to see the deep connection, the intersection between disability issues and the broader agenda and how they connect up to so many different issues that really can make America a place of opportunity for all. So with that, I want to turn it back to the CAP events folks so that we can have a great discussion in responding to this. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Castro.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alyssa Thompson, and I am a senior fellow at CAP, along with being a social worker and an activist. I am very honored to be amongst you today as the moderator for this incredible panel. We have three incredible guests that will be talking about disability with us. The first is Ella Callow, which is the ADA 504 Compliance Officer, Director of the Office of Disability Access and Compliance at the University of California, Berkeley. We have Sandy Ho, who is the founder of the Disability Intersectionality Summit, Research Associate at the Laurie Institute for Disability Policy, and Nicole Lee, who is the founder of Inclusive Life and Nicole Lee Consulting, LLC. I see everybody's finally popped up. Nice to see y'all faces. Before we begin, I want to take care of a bit of housekeeping. I want to remind everyone to submit your questions in the question box in the control panel, because there will be a Q&A section at the end, and we want to share your thoughts and answer what we can as we go through the panel. So I'm just going to dive right in, because I know we all got a lot to share and a lot to say in this short amount of time that we're together. This is a question for everybody. What does the ADA anniversary mean to each of you? How about Sandy? Why don't you start? While Sandy's figuring out. Oh, you got it? Oh, yep.
Sorry about that. So before I begin my thoughts, I wanted to give a quick image description of myself. I am an Asian American woman with dark hair, and I'm wearing a dark blue and white button-up shirt. So when I think about the 80th anniversary, I often think about how I used to describe my childhood experience, right? I would say things like I was the only one in my classroom or in my schools who identified as having a disability. I was often in my neighborhood or in the clubs that I was in. I'm the only child with a disability in my YMCA swim class. When looking at employment options, like I didn't really know other disabled people who were employed. And so when I think about the exposure and visibility. Right now, I know in my grad program, I'm not the only disabled student. In my workplace at the Lurie Institute, I'm proud to say that I am not the only disabled researcher. And in my community, right? So I know that I'm not the only Asian American, queer, disabled woman. And I think that is an indication of progress for the ADA. It's that exposure and visibility. But at the same time, having grown up as a member of the ADA generation, you know, Senator Warren in her earlier remarks talked about how the ADA should be the floor and not the ceiling. And so the ADA anniversary to me also means expecting that from all of our disability policies, and not just within the disability issue, because every issue is a disability issue. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Nicole, why don't you go next?
Sure, thank you so much. So I am Nicole Lee, my pronouns are she, her. I am an African American woman wearing a black sweater and a yellow shirt. I am so honored to be a part of this for so many reasons. The anniversary, what it means to me, you know, for most of my life, I went through with a lot of privilege and ability, or at least I saw myself that way. I then moved to being an activist and really understanding very viscerally from being in a lot of different situations what intersectionality really means. And so I saw myself as an ally. It is later in life that I have had experience with disability and now am a person with a disability. I'm also raising a daughter with a disability, and my disability is invisible, right? Quote unquote invisible. People don't know, people don't see it, and yet I also recognize that when they do, there is a level of discrimination and bias that comes into play. And feeling that and knowing that as a reality is much different than being an ally to it. I can speak to that. What the anniversary really means to me, it's both, as I said, a personal and professional journey, but it reminds me and affirms to me that my humanity matters. It matters regardless of what I do, how I show up, and everyone else's humanity matters as well. And in the moment in time that we're in this country, that message is a message the disabled community can uniquely give to everyone else who does not see themselves as a part of the community in order to really bring forth some real change that all of us need. That's what it means to me.
Ella?
Hi, Melissa. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Housekeeping. So my pronouns are she and her. Visual description, woman with long dark hair and glasses in front of a bookcase with a striped shirt. And I'm coming to you from Berkeley, which I'd like to acknowledge is unceded Chochenyo Ohlone land. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about what the ADA means to me, the ADA at 30. Having worked across a variety of domains within the United States governmental system and now at the university system, I really find that the continual thread is that the ADA represents one of those moments when Americans did not disappoint themselves, when Americans created something utterly breathtakingly successful in its scope and accomplishments, of acknowledging the dignity and the worth of disabled lives and the beauty of disability culture and community, and ensuring that the basic promises that are ensured to other populations in this country are extended to disabled people and that they're enfranchised across all the various classes and other types of divisions in this country. And that is something we've been able to contribute to the world and meet the world at our doors and work on and create international alliances and truly a global movement to lift human dignity. And that's something that's really important to hold to when we're in moments where the body politic is really regressive and there's great difficulty. So it's something to keep us going. It's something to hearken to when we feel like, all is lost this week with the latest horrible story we're hearing.
And, if I just care to share, I think for me, the ADA, it's just about how much we've made progress. All of us really been impacted by this mandate. It's what our life that we mostly know. And just seeing how there's still much change needs to be done. Which is why we're all here, which is why we do our individual work, as activists, and our other professional hats that we wear. It's just really, it's a time of celebration and a time of also sobering to know that we made a lot of progress, but we're still fighting for the basics still. And, and in that time of dealing with those mixed feelings, just knowing that, not losing hope, but still being energized when you're in community with incredible folks like everyone on this call, when we have incredible leaders like Secretary Castro and Senator Warren, who understands what our needs are and speak about them unapologetically and are intentional and include them in the policy and the work that they do. It gives you the fire that you need in your belly to really continue to push forward. But now, Ella, a question for you. Given there's been much discussion about what schools may look like in the fall, in your role as the ADA compliance officer at Berkeley, a school with a significant history of disability engagement, what are you worried about for your students? And what do you think schools should do to ensure the right balance of safety and making sure disabled students don't fall behind?
Yeah, thank you so much, Felisa. It's such an important question. I've kind of broken it down into my worries and then my recommendations or strategies. One of the first things I'm worried about is just the practical ability of academic institutions to adequately master creation of accessible remote online content, as well as thoroughly and holistically vet all the technology needed to take it then and move it online, and that will be so heavily relied upon. For how long, we don't even know. And you add to this that there's a question of a student's ability to secure technology, access to benefit from it. As Senator Warren pointed out, we still have digital divide. So that's a big, basic practical concern. Secondly, I'm concerned about the undermining reality of poverty in the lives of many disabled students, particularly Black, Indigenous, and immigrant students with disabilities. More students with disabilities we know are in poverty or economically fragile. And for them, honestly, campuses have become de facto social safety nets in the face of the collapse of a national one during decades of neoliberalism and austerity and this increasing stratification among the rich and the rest. Something that both the Senator and Secretary Castro sort of alluded to and spoke to. Thirdly, the particular impact this displacement and loss of in-person health, therapeutic assessment, and support services is having for students with mental health involvement, those who are neurodivergent, autistic students, etc. And then you add to that BIPOC students who are experiencing serious trauma and deep grief due to the disparate levels of COVID-related deaths and illness in their communities, and their efforts to support the uprising against state violence in their communities over the last many months. So I particularly appreciated Senator Warren's recognition of this issue of needing to build capacity for an increased need for mental health, even though the tendency is to go, we have no money, we're in a recession, we're gonna have to create more capacity. Two more, the loss of access to disability community and culture for students at this key moment in their human development as young people, and also in a moment of national unraveling, when you more than ever would rely on your disabled peers, disabled cultural institutions. Not being able to access that for many of them will be very trying. Finally, the pressure that students with disabilities are going to feel to move to in-person education when and if it's offered due to all these things. So them feeling there's a need to come back, even if they don't feel it's safe for their health, in order to ameliorate or address these other issues. How do we create safety, any level of parity or success for them? I think we need to avoid tiered learning. I think we need to not be having in-person and online at the same time because of that pressure. So until science says it's safe for everyone, I'm not sure that we can have anyone. Secondly, ensuring that remote learning involves collaboration with 3 groups on any campus: disability expertise, IT expertise, and academia. We have to have that tripod of support so that students will have a meaningful even opportunity to overcome the digital divide and get in on learning. We have to acknowledge the poor, America. We're not great at that, except that our students with disabilities are disproportionately poor or financially fragile. So if they can't come pick up the groceries from our free food pantry on campus, we have to figure out ways to get, benefit cards or vouchers to them. If we can't get them safe housing, we need to turn our housing experts into remote housing advocates. We're gonna have to find a way to bring our social net online. We have to properly fund disabled student services to mimic our onlining of academic work. We've got to be able to get things like TRIO, which provides academic coaching, career counseling, peer tutoring online, and make that as robust of a push as getting academics online. Finally, we have to commit ethically and morally to grace and to humanity and simply plan to support an increase in a population of disabled students presenting with mental health issues and exacerbations, and support their having to lean more heavily into their accommodations. So those are sort of my 5 problems, 5 sort of takes on solutions.
No, I think that's a very robust list of things to do, and being in conversation with a lot of people, a lot of things that we've been touching on. Yeah, I know for me as a social worker, I've been thinking about the importance of touch and play for our younger kids, and even for the bigger ones. We already know how schools, have either reduced or eliminated recess. We know about the policing of disabled students of color, with the new rules that may be enforced, who may be more impacted by that. So there's a lot of things from
Yes.
K-12 or collegiate that we need to start having honest conversations about what campus will look like for our kids.
Yes, things as simple as if you're going to have people at the door to double check how many people are going into a building, who's going to be at the door, who feels safe with who's at the door, how do we train the people at the door, right? So that we don't start triggering other inequities due to intersectionality for those students. Yeah, from little kids all the way up to tertiary education, it's just massively challenging. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Nicole, you've been instrumental in helping families talk about race, police, violence, and so forth. As a parent of a child with a disability, a parent with a disability, and an activist and lawyer, what are your thoughts on how we can talk about the intersection of the virus, the resistance efforts, and this 2020 dumpster fire in general with our families?
Well, the first part of it, and I think that Senator Warren and Secretary Castro said it in a much nicer way than we will. It is a dumpster fire. It is a dumpster fire. The other word that I hear folks using is a reckoning. And I feel 2 ways about that, because while there are many ways that this country, a reckoning makes sense, this reckoning is falling on the same folks that things always fall down on. Black folks, Latino folks, folks with disabilities, LGBT youth, right? And so it's more of the same, and it's compounded by all of these different things happening. Theories are being discussed like George Floyd, that was horrible. And there's been so many horrible moments before, right? And so many of those horrible moments actually involve our youth with disabilities. The disabled community was very much impacted. And yet now we have this outpouring in part because lots of folks were sitting at home, right, ready to watch social media, ready to get involved in something. And so we have this just groundswell of interest. My question as a mom of a disabled kid and folks that are been involved in movement work is, so like, what do we do with that? And I think one of the first things we have when we're talking about it, we have to tell our stories. We need to tell the stories of the folks that have been in these movement moments, the disabled community, Black and Brown community, and the intersections, right, within that. It's not that we haven't been involved. We've been involved. We've been at the forefront, but our stories are not told. One of the things as a Black woman who considers herself a part of this community, part of a disabled community, is I know that it's not only about telling those individual stories, about individual identities, we also need to be telling each other's stories. Because within those stories is wisdom, it's movement wisdom, right? It's 30 years of struggle, it's 50 years of struggle. So really providing that information for folks and also strengthening our bonds together, right? Strengthening our bonds and our understanding. So when I got involved in looking at what was happening with police violence, I saw it very acutely as a Black and Brown issue. And you know what it is? It's also an issue for the disabled community. And I have sat with families around this country who have just sobbed, not believing that the police would harm their child. They would harm their child. And that interaction happened because that person was living with a disability. And so we need to tell those stories. We need to tell the complicated stories. We also need to affirm that there is a way forward. And it grieves me that, again, the same people that are the most impacted are actually the folks that are going to be there with the solution. I'm going to shout out Melissa for a second because the work that she's done within the movement for Black Lives, it's powerful and it's important. And it's important that we're there representing ourselves, not just on the front lines. Because I've seen this in the front lines for a long time. Folks who used wheelchairs being just pummeled by the police. I know that their video just came out. I've seen that firsthand many, many times in Ferguson, right? Those stories need to be told, not just the story of the victimization, but the story of the stand-up, the story of the organizing, the story of the advocacy, and who is really in leadership. So I am grieved at this moment. It is a dumpster fire that people who are in power have caused. And I do talk about a reckoning. I believe there should be a reckoning there. And at the same time, we are the ones we've been waiting for. We're the ones that are going to make this change with allies like Secretary Castro and Senator Warren. But it's essential that we feel empowered, if you will, to take the lead for our own struggles.
I agree with that, Nicole. Doing work with Movement for Black Lives, it's critical for our movement spaces to get on board on disability. A lot of them are missing the mark. We all know that. A lot of them talk about issues like police violence and school to prison pipeline and don't include disability, and it's our people of color spaces that don't. And it's a true disheartening moment when you don't get seen by your own. So now is the time, and I do agree with you, there is a reckoning to be had. And if it doesn't happen, when?
Right. Like how much more, right? What else do we need? And part of it, I teach about having these courageous conversations around quote unquote difference. Well, here's the deal. At some point, the courageous conversation is one that you scream. It's where you sit down and you demand. And I'm not sure if there is another time. What more? What more do we need to see? But we can do that in solidarity with each other. And your work in particular is going to pave the way. I believe that. And I've seen it.
Thank you for that, Nicole. And really, everybody's work on here is a part of that effort to create the space needed to demand and not wait. And I think that's what we've all been doing in our own way in our work, is to demand the change and not wait politely, because there's no time to be polite right now. There's time to get real. All right, Sandy, now to you. You've run the Disability and Intersectionality Summit the past few years. and it has evolved in its own online presence before doing online activity was a standard. Now that the disability community has discovered intersectionality, though we know not always accurately, what do you think they still have to learn? And another part to that is, what do non-disability organizations have to learn about creating an inclusive place for discussion?
So this is a question that book chapters and even entire books could be written on, and I'm sure that such works do exist. So I'm going to start off with some of my thoughts of what disability community needs to know, and then get into non-disability organizations. So one thing that I learned in the process of organizing the summit is that the actual day of the presentations and of the conference is really like 1%, if that, of the intentional intersectional work that has gone into organizing. And I think disability community has yet to necessarily realize that the visibility of people of different race, ethnic backgrounds, of LGBTQIA, of multiple disabilities is not the definition of intersectionality. That is, right, like the actual person of on our panels, of our presenters, that visibility of it is very little of the intersectional work that has gone into what has led to spaces that are intentionally inclusive and intersectional. It is about the months of working with a cross-disability team of volunteer activists from across the country, who themselves have various privileges and experience various oppressions. It is about having conversations of power, of our organizing team, of what we want power to be like in our intersectional summit. It is about talking with a young disabled person who maybe this is their first time presenting. It is about making sure that the questions we are asking on our call for proposals is succinct, it is accessible, that it serves a purpose for our summit of how we make our decisions around who presents. And it is also about ensuring that every single presenter is paid. Everybody on this panel and Senators Warren and Secretary Castro have talked about the poverty levels and the disparate employment rates. Disability community, I think, has taken advantage of a lot of the people who do the intersectional work. And specifically, I look to Black, disabled femmes, women, and other people of color, who are often the ones who are carrying the responsibility and the burden of the work. And so when we're thinking about intersectional spaces and access, it can't just be about the ramps and the elevators anymore, right? And we all know this. When we talk about access, are we talking about financial accessibility of conference spaces? Who gets to go to present at conferences? You have to have the right letters after your name. You have to have presented in the right journals. And not giving power to folks in our community who are multiply marginalized, who are BIPOC, controls the narrative. And I really like what Nicole talked about of sharing our narratives, sharing our experiences, not because we're disabled, but because that is where there is the solution. That is where the community's ingeniousness and creativity really comes through. So every time somebody in the organization approaches me and says, "Hey, Sandy, you do intersectionality work. Can you come and talk about it?" So after having done a number of these presentations, I've kind of begun to realize that the implied message of that request is, we don't do this work, but you do. And again, I would reiterate that this responsibility shows the lack of commitment that our broader community has yet to make to intentional and meaningful intersectional work. Because when I talk to the staff of those organizations, specifically disabled BIPOC staff of the organization, I'm learning that leadership is not always listening, it's not always amplifying, it's not always hearing and open to the ideas of their own staff. And when I say supporting and amplifying and hearing disabled BIPOC staff of the organization, importantly, I think to that is setting the boundaries so it doesn't just fall on the shoulders of the staff members. And that this is really needs to be a cross vertical and horizontal commitment to the work within the hierarchy of organizations. So really, I would like for our community to get to a point where I get more requests like, hey, we'd love your thoughts on how we can implement intersectional practices. Here are some ideas our team has put together. What are the groups that are already working on these issues? Because the issues that are being advocated for are not unique. We know that these issues exist. There are leaders in the grassroots movement that have been working, that have been building in the coalitions and the relationships to make this work happen. So for non-disability organizations, first of all, there are disabled people who are already in the organizations, that are already a part of your communities you are working with, that you are serving. Definitely disabled people within your sphere of impact, because again, every issue is a disability policy issue. And so, although to non-disability organizations, you might not think of them as disabled, and you might not be using that language, you might not be capturing the numbers and recording that data, but the fact of the matter is, our people are your people. And so this cuts across every community and every social and every progressive movement and issue that you're working on. So my advice to non-disability organizations in creating inclusive places of discussion, I'm gonna use an Animal Crossing analogy here because I think that is going to illustrate what I'm about to say the best. But I want non-disability organizations to show up with the same level of commitment it takes to breed your hybrid flowers on your island. What does that mean? It means that we know it takes time. There is a strategy. There is cross-pollination involved. There's commitment involved. You need to DIY that recipe, right? And so for all of you non-Animal Crossing players, first of all, I'm sorry. But what it means is that, again, our people are also your people, and what you do in every action and decision and recruitment effort and advocacy issue that you do is also impacting the civil community. And so for disabled people, having a history of having our story, having our data, having our families, having our health information stolen from us, that takes power away. Right? That means that somebody else is driving the discussion. Somebody else is driving the policy solutions. And so creating an inclusive place where discussion can't happen until trusting relationships begin. And I think that finally, just overall, my understanding of having been in these spaces of having identified as a disability community organizer is that as community organizers, we don't get to decide where the finish line is for a community. Our job, I think, is that we get to move that finish line forward a little bit more each time. But we can support the vision and the dreams. And so I would like to urge both disability and non-disability communities to remember this and also to be more of the bridge builders out there and to work together.
I love that you use the Animal Crossing reference because In social work, it reminded me of the phrase meeting people where they are. It says Animal Crossing is the undeclared video game for the pandemic. I think that resonated with more people than what you realize. Thank you. All right. We have one last question for the whole group, but before I say that, I want to remind everybody to submit your questions to in the chat box, in the questions box, so that when we do the Q&A, your thoughts and questions can be one amongst selected. Now to our last question for everybody, and this is for everyone. What is one thing about the ADA or disability that you wish people knew? And where do you want to be at ADA 50? What about Nicole? Why don't you start that?
Well, I'm really inspired by just what I've heard on this panel, and I'm going to go back to something that Ella said and that Sandy further illustrated. I want people to understand it really is all of us or none of us. We all are in this. As much as we have, quote unquote, evolved in our societies where we can be so separate, where all of us can be in our respective homes even and be at a conference with hundreds of people, right? That's real. And also collectively, we really need each other. There's so much that folks that do not consider themselves a part of the disability community can learn from the disability community, just like there's so much that our society could learn from the Black community, right? And again, and all the other intersections. We are not going to be able to move our society forward if we keep pretending that, oh, this is just special for some people, right? That's even the term, and I understand it's an important term, even the term accommodation, right? Equity really, at the end of the day, means we make sure that everyone has what they particularly need to be successful, right? And so at ADA 50, I hope that we don't have to say all of us or none of us. I hope that that is so ingrained in how we live our lives in this society that that's a foregone conclusion, and our children can take that for granted.
Ella?
Thank you. Yeah, I love that sentiment. Thank you for that, Nicole. One thing I wish people knew about the ADA, where do I want us to be at ADA 50? One thing I want people to know about the ADA, having been in higher education for a few years now, specific to academia, I will say, that the deep-seated anxiety that exists within academia that feels the increases in disabled college students on their campuses and the use of accommodations as some sort of con to gain unfair advantage, that it is a knee-jerk and xenophobia-like response by establishment insiders, and that it has ugly precedents. When Black people began voting during Reconstruction, the racists in the political establishment yelled fraud and claimed it was undermining the validity of voting. When LGBTQIA people were close to gaining marriage equality, the homophobics within the religious establishment yelled fraud and claimed they were ruining the institution of marriage. And now when disabled students can thrive, not just survive, but thrive K-12, thanks to the numerous iterations of the IDEA that didn't even get completed until the 2000s. And when they're able to get accommodations to go to college, thanks to the 2010 ADA Amendments Act, the ableists within higher education establishments begin yelling fraud and claim that the increase is due to gamesmanship and corruption of accommodation use. I want them to know that doing this puts them on the same side of history as those other bigots and racists, and that they can and should be better than revanchist knee-jerk responses to recently enfranchised groups in their part of the American establishment. As a person who has disabilities myself, who has psychiatric involvement myself, who has a kid who can only access education because of a 504, it's personally hurtful to me when I hear this across academia, in articles, in op-eds, in writings, or if I have to hear it in person, especially when I have to hear it at Berkeley, which is our hallowed ground for the movement, you know? So that's something I'd really like people to know. Where I want us to be at ADA 50, my friend Kim Schock, who's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and also the poet laureate for the city of San Francisco, she writes poems to keep us going on social media right now. And she wrote one today, she posted, and a line said, "There are things you live through that you don't survive." And I want the ADA as a body of work to live through this challenging and regressive period in our body politic, but not just that, but to survive intact in letter, which is always being challenged, and also in spirit. I want to be looking back and holding colloquia at ADA 50 on the ADA protests of 2025, when Americans came together intersectionally and occupied governor's offices and congresses nationally until universities and social safety nets were adequately funded to support disabled people and all people so that we could all experience American prosperity, and particularly that the promise of Olmsted could be realized. I want it to be an Olmsted period that we're experiencing. That would be what I would love to see at ADA 50.
Thank you for that, Sandy.
So, yeah, I think that at ADA 50, the ADA generation will also be in our 50s. And to say that gives me chills. And it is also the why I'm excited by policies that include like home and community-based services in economic plans, rather than relegating it to just another disability policy plan, because in the next 30 years, we know that the number of people who will need long-term support and services will double, and that includes our generation. And so by the time the ADA is 50 years old, I want us to be at a point where we are making the connections between what our communities are experiencing and the policies, and in between those, the research and the questions that need to be asked, and making sure that importantly, those questions and the research that is coming to the fore is driven by disability community and disabled BIPOC leaders in particular, because otherwise we know the consequences. We are living that consequence right now. And what I wish people would know about the ADA is that, yes, the ADA is about protecting our civil rights and our access. But the understanding is access is also about having power. Right? The ADA is about economic power for disabled people's right to employment. It is about the power of having social mobility and social networks. So much of that comes from somebody's education experiences. The power of taking up space in public through public transportation. The power to share our ideas and communicate. And the power of civic engagement and the right to secretly, independently, and anonymously vote. And so, as I look towards the future, I want us to be doing the work that is building the coalition and the relationships and the infrastructure of our country that will realize those connections.
I think, those remarks are so incredible. And Sandy, I don't know whether to thank you or to feel humbled at knowing that we'll all be 50 something by the time we get to the 50th anniversary of the ADA. But I think for me, I just wish that when it comes to disability and the ADA 50th anniversary, we have more diversity in our community. I think that the history of the ADA, we talk a lot about the white elders in the community, and I hope that as we go into ADA 35, 40, 45, 50, in particular as we become the elders in the community, we have more diversity of, racial diversity, queer diversity of the storytellings, and not just the white, cis, heterosexual, or Christian, voices, my understanding what everyone played a role in the enactment of the act and getting the act stronger, getting getting our rights, standing up for them, being for them as much as we can, over the course of the act. And that's what my goal is for 8850 is for the community to truly tell the full story and not just the story that gets a little glitter when we have the anniversary. But now, to your questions that you all have been putting great questions in the chat. So we just want to dive right in. From Laura, and you all, Sandy, Ella, and Nicole, jump in on what moves you in response. How do we address the popular and ableist attitude in accommodation in education that students should be able to grow out of or beyond their accommodations?
I'll jump in on this one since education is my my vehicle at the moment. I think that one of the big problems we have is that people with disabilities are expected to disappear upon adulthood in this country. There is, having worked and worked with Rebecca Coakley a great deal around the rights of parents with disabilities, I literally almost every time that I was explaining to someone the work that my organization did, the National Center for Parents with Disabilities and Their Families, they would go, "Oh, so you work with kids with disabilities?" And I go, "No, I'm working with parents who have disabilities and have had their children taken by the system." And they couldn't wrap their head around this concept. The eugenics policy period in this country wiped people with disabilities as adults from the public imagination in a way that is exceedingly difficult to undo and has remained so, and will remain so, as I think, as long as media and Hollywood and our representations are not controlled by the community and reflect the reality of the community. At the university level, this is probably part of what we struggle with as well, why there's so much confusion, quote unquote, and pushback as to why there are so many people with disabilities now on campus, because they're not supposed to be disabled after the age of 18 apparently. So that it is a huge problem. I think continually reminding people that that is the problem, that you think that these people are supposed to cease to exist at 18, that it's your issue to undo and unlearn, and that we will and must and legally are required to, if not ethically driven to in some people's cases, continue to provide the same civil rights to adults with disabilities as we believe we do to children. Although children and children with disabilities are one of the most impoverished, least respected groups in this country. The amount of childism in America is shocking. But yeah, I think it's going to be part of pushing it back on people to own this, investigate this, interrogate and unpack it, and continuing to insist on those rights for adults.
Thank you. Question from Kevin. How can we make sure people with intellectual disabilities have and its perspectives are included in our discussions about the ADA?
So I can start to answer this question, and I'm sure my two panelists can chime in as well. But I can share examples of ways that this has been implemented in either my community organizing work around organizing the Intersectionality Summit and also in the disability policy research work as well. So there is, and something that I think our disability community tries to not confront, is the hierarchy that exists. And when we're talking about people with intellectual disabilities, that is often a group and a community that gets left out of discussions, that gets ignored, that gets advocated for and on behalf of. And so in the Intersectionality Summit, what we strive to do is ensuring that there isn't any, there's not like one call for proposals for everybody and then another one for people with intellectual disabilities. And so by that, putting forth your ideas and submitting your ideas and the thoughts that you have and what you're passionate about, what you want to talk about, it's all on, it's all not only just very transparent, but we're all doing it in a way that ensures access to our ideas and to engage in the community. And so when we're talking about disability policy research, the Lurie Institute makes an effort to create easy read and plain language documents after our studies are completed. And not only that, but it is led by, and I'm proud to say this, Finn Gardner, who is Black, trans, and autistic. And the reason why that's important is because the information that needs to get to advocates and people with intellectual disabilities, it needs to be framed and done and made accessible in a way that is also coming from somebody who identifies in that community. And it is not done in a way that is demeaning or looks down upon people, which I think is often a stigma that still exists within our own community.
I really appreciate what Sandy said, and it reflects her obvious, depth of experience and history working across populations in the community itself. I think it's really important, you're right, to recognize the hierarchical treatment of different groups, and that's gone on always. That's been a complaint always in the disability community. Having done conferences around parents with intellectual disabilities, plain language is so exceedingly important. Also, understanding and doing work around how people with intellectual disabilities what types of approaches they may benefit from to being in live event situations or to learning material, thinking about multiple modalities of inclusion and also preparing people ahead of time for participating in discussion and collaboration. It takes meaningful pre-planned attention. It can't be done on the fly and at the last minute. So I think that that's something that's always difficult because, as has been pointed out, so often this work is being done by people who are already overburdened trying to do it for little or no pay on top of other jobs and their own families and their own disabilities. But it's so enriching to bring everyone to the table. It's something that people have to start looking at more.
Definitely agree. And we got time to squeeze in one more from Jamila. How do we prevent things like kids with ADHD and other learning disabilities like Grace in Michigan from being sent to juvenile detention for not doing their homework during virtual school because not doing homework violated her probation? And I think that's very a current issue. And I know we all understand the story of Grace, and I really felt that it's important to bring that up and to uplift her right now.
I wasn't sure if that was for Ella. Can everyone hear me? Just want to make sure you can hear me. Okay, I wasn't sure if it was, but I wanted to speak to that because we cannot we can't say enough. There's not enough time to really talk about how racism and ableism are playing out during this pandemic. Our education system, and I know Ella can speak to much of this as well, our education system is geared, at least in part, towards some of our children ending up in the criminal justice system. There are so many factors to this, and it is affecting Black and brown children at a pandemic rate. Before this pandemic, we had some other pandemics, right? And I think that what we have to think about in terms of what the upheaval that the coronavirus, in terms of the expectations, the norms that many of our children and adults rely on, not just adults with disabilities or children with disabilities, but everyone, right? Even those folks that consider themselves able-bodied. This was quite a shift. And so I also work in schools. I work in pre-K to 12 a lot. And you see that children who had ADHD or children who have anxiety, their ability to show up to this new norm and follow these new rules are frankly really hindered by the fact that, one, there's disability at play. Also, this is not usual. This is not what they were anticipating. And for some children, often children who are white, children who have economic means, they get pods. They get private teachers now. And I'm actually not, folks got to do what folks got to do, I suppose, right? But it is saddening to me that then we incarcerate other children who are not able to adapt. And we have to ask ourselves, like, should that be what the standard that we're using for any child? When you start adding in race and disability, it really, for me, raises so many more questions. So we have to name the anti-Blackness within our education system. Again, like, if not now, when? We have to name the anti-Blackness. We have to name, and Ella said it so eloquently, I'm frankly terrified to follow up and repeat it. But when she talked about the fact that we do such a horrific job while we pat ourselves on the back on accommodating our young people and accommodating our adults. I mean, the fact that we can even take credit for anything is laughable. And so under these conditions, to see a child penalized in this way, and this one is sensational, but I know, and all of us know, many stories of children and adults who are not able to, quote unquote, adapt, right, quickly enough, that they have been penalized in micro ways and macro ways as well. And that's a part of living in an ableist society. And we need to call that out as well as we call out the anti-Blackness.
Ella or Sandy, do you have any points for that last one?
I just want to say, as a mother particularly, that the case just terrifies me. All these cases terrify me. The fact that our nation incarcerates and subjects to things like solitary confinement our children horrifies and embarrasses and shames me as an American. It is literally a house on fire, as one particularly poignant book that discusses the juvenile incarceration system discusses. But for children of color, for Black children particularly, and for disabled children, it is a throwback to an almost medieval sentiment about the worth of poor people. Because let's be honest, it's jail for poor people and something else for everyone else, right? But jail is for poor people, child welfare is for poor people. These poverty systems are so medieval, so undeveloped and unconscious in their treatment of our children. It's disgusting. And I just, my heart is with her mother and with her family and with that child. Yeah, and I think Nicole summed it up exactly right. We just, this is the moment to call it out, and this is the moment to say, she is emblematic of, as well as being in and of herself, a valid point of focus for what is happening across this country and always does. This is not new for most of our communities. This is not new for the people that we champion and work with and advocate for.
But definitely, it's not new. And I think Grace's story, highlights the disparity that disabled Black girls go through in our schools, the criminalization of them, the anti-Blackness, Nicole said, along with misogynoir, that Black women and girls endure because we possess these bodies and these experiences. And it's so heartbreaking because she's not the only one. And we're seeing her trauma, because this is trauma. This is a child here, being played out for our viewing. And I think this is a upsetting reality that we may see as the pandemic continues, as our schools open up, what can happen to our Black disabled students, and our disabled students of color who will be criminalized because, like Nicole said, they cannot adapt. And I think we all have to realize as adults, some of us are barely able to adapt. And we need to extend that grace, especially to our children, as they're having questions and trying to understand the world that we're now being forced to live in and the realities of that. I understand that they're experiencing trauma just like we are every day. So yes, I definitely want to make sure that we uplift Grace, say her name, fight for her, particularly support the activists in Michigan who are on the ground doing what they can. And I think that's a really important charge for our community to herald and uphold during as we celebrate the ADA and know that the work still continues after the 26th. Well, I think that has been our time. Thank you to everyone for being a part of this panel. Thank you, Ella, Sandy, Nicole, for your questions. And thank you all for attending this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Melissa.
Thank you.